Well, that didn't work out like I hoped. All right, well, welcome everybody. It's good to see all of you. Keith is roaming the country this week, so he won't be here. So I'm gonna blatantly cheat off my notes to make sure I don't forget something, and you guys should all remind me because I probably will forget something anyway. As usual, keeping up with the meetup events and also just in general Austin tech events. I've got the URLs and the Twitter accounts on the board there. Is there somebody here from Own Local tonight? No. Okay. Who's been here before? Who's been to this meetup before? All right, welcome back. And who is this the first time? Wow, great. Okay. Welcome to the Austin Homegrown API meetup, guys. Let's see. Who in the room is consuming APIs? And who's building APIs? All right, so that's a pretty even split. All right, I'm not going to do the tech stack thing. Keith does that. It just runs on forever, so we'll save that for next time. But tonight we've got somebody is responsible for at least one really awesome word and one really cool technology that you all know, webhooks, and is also responsible for in a big way. My understanding is for the Docker that we have all are all still learning how to use. I guess I'll speak for myself at least there. So without further ado, Jeff, Lindsay.
How many of you are programmers? Or loosely defined programmers? Yeah, I thought this would be a good topic for this audience in general, APIs and stuff like that. Let me quickly sound. Okay. I use sound, so that works. Okay, making the world more programmable. Or why generativity is important. Neither of those really explains what I'm going to talk about, so let's do it. So some context. I've been a programmer for 20 years. That's exactly 2/3 of my life, so the majority of it. Professional programmer. I was a programmer even longer. I've been doing, for the last 10 years, I've been doing mostly open source, and not even open source for like companies, but like completely rogue, independent open source stuff. I kind of have a big thing in, I like hacker culture. I helped start Super Happy Dev House in the Bay Area and Hacker Dojo, which was the largest hacker spaces. I should turn my phone off. Which is relevant to this talk. And also, yeah, webhooks, Docker. Docker was like just to clarify, so I was, my friend Solomon turns out he was, we weren't friends yet, but he was an old client of mine, and then he reached out on collaborating on a project. I was thinking about this container manager thing, and he's like, we kind of have like a container manager thing, but the guy that started it got taken to Google, so I took over the project. I worked on it while I was in Python, and then had a lot of influence. And then at some point, they were like, we're going to pivot the company to this. And so then I was sort of like a third-party thing. So like, the Docker's $1 billion valuation, I have nothing to do with, even though like I was, kind of a big part of that. But I did build a project called Doku, which is one of the first killer apps for it. It's an open source Heroku. And on GitHub, I have over 100 projects, so I think it's safe to say I'm an open source programmer. Not all of them are great. Some of them are abandoned, but if you were to add up all the stars on those GitHub projects, it would be the 17th most starred project on GitHub, which is up there with Linux and Ruby on Rails and Docker. So yeah, I write a lot of open source, and unlike I think a lot of open source hackers, they sort of get excited about a technology and then they like build stuff as they're learning or as they're exploring. I'm very intentional. All those like over 100 projects have very specific, like they're part of a bigger picture, which is, it's been really hard to convey that with so many projects and over so much time. So I'm starting to frame it as make the world more programmable, which is really, one of the first talks I gave about webhooks was called Webhooks in the Programmable World of Tomorrow. So it has been kind of a theme in all of my work. And a lot of my work, like I built a lot of, so besides like webhooks and Docker, there's a lot of like tools to support those things. In the Docker ecosystem, I've written a lot of stuff that's ended up in a lot of other open source projects and products and services. And on the webhook side, things like request bin and stuff like this to help support that. And I really wish I was going to give you like a really tangible demo. That's my favorite thing to do, is give demos that blow your mind. But instead, this is more of like a high-level talk. So, making the world more programmable. What do I mean? Well, that mostly manifests in building developer infrastructure, which I define as like tools and ideas to further empower developers and programmers. Not just professional programmers, anybody that's learning to program. And I think that's really important, and that's kind of what this talk is about. But kind of the idea behind this is, if it's easy, more people will do it. So I try and make things easy and accessible, and then that gets more people to do it. Webhooks, it's like I want more people to do integrations and kind of do evented programming at the web API level. So webhooks sort of makes that easy. Docker was like, I want to make platforms, kind of composable and be able to build up your own Heroku-like platforms. Docker makes that easy. And what I mean by empowerment is like being able to do more, right? We have this really great skill being a programmer, and we have these superpowers, and we get these superpowers from things like libraries and tools and APIs. So for example, image processing libraries. Now you have this superpower where you can do like image processing, or using Twilio, for example. I worked at Twilio for a while. And that gives you the capability to make and receive phone calls and text messages. And then you know about AWS, all that infrastructure stuff. But actually Amazon has some really interesting APIs where you can actually like send packages to them and they'll store it in their warehouse. And then you have an API to like send that thing wherever you want. So it's a warehouse as a service API. And then, are any of you familiar with Transcriptic? It's a little biotech startup in California. And they give you more or less an API to a robotic biotech lab. And so someone recently did a blog post on how they can basically create any kind of protein with a few $100s and some Python. So it's kind of like magical powers, right? You can do a lot. There's just more and more things that you can do with APIs and with libraries and all this stuff. And so I want to, a lot of those, that sort of like more capabilities is a natural thing. There's a lot of other stuff that I try and do that is sort of biased towards making the world more programmable. So I'll get to what I mean by that specifically. The problem with this, though, is that there's no business model for this. So there's no like company that I could start to push this agenda. If I did, it would be kind of like it'd be something very specific and indirectly in support of this, and it would probably fail, and so my time would be worthless. So I'd rather just like make a lot of open source software and share knowledge and ideas and stuff like that. So it's not been specifically profitable to do this for the last 10 years, especially being increasingly obsessed with this idea. So, why am I doing this? And kind of the majority of this talk is about this context because I'm gonna build up a lexicon to sort of explain this, but I think it also kind of explains hacker culture, which I find interesting. But if nothing else, it's just some ideas for you to chew on. Okay. So this guy's Kevin Kelly. He's one of the founding editors of Wired as well as a Whole Earth catalog. Anybody familiar with the Whole Earth catalog? Okay. So he recently, semi-recently, wrote a book called What Technology Wants. Anybody read this book? Okay. It's a great book. So I'm going to go back to talking about technology in general, because it's not really talked about that much. And so he went to actually did one of the first sort of modern philosophical explorations of like, what is technology? And so he gave a lot of talks. And so he's one of the things he covers in the book is, what is the significance of technology, and how do you define technology? Like, it's obviously not just new stuff. So I'm going to play a clip real quick of him explaining this, because he does a better job than I do.
Another way to think about technology, what it means is to imagine a world without technology. If we were to eliminate every single bit of technology in the world today, and I mean everything, from blades to scrapers to cloth, we as a species would not live very long. We would die by the billions, and very quickly the wolves would get us. We would be defenseless. We would be unable to grow enough food or find enough food. Even the hunter-gatherers used some elementary tools. What technology brought, through the very simple tools like these stone tools here, even something as small as this, the early bands of humans were actually able to eliminate to extinction about 250 megafauna animals in North America when they first arrived 10,000 years ago. So long before our industrial age, we've been affecting the planet on a global scale with just a small amount of technology. So with a little bit of technology, humans went from a small band of 10,000 or so, the same number as the Neanderthals everywhere, and we suddenly exploded. With the invention of language around 50,000 years ago, the number of humans exploded and very quickly became the dominant species on the planet. And they migrated into the rest of the world at 2 kilometers per year until within several tens of thousands of years, we occupied every single watershed on the planet and became the most dominant species with a very small amount of technology. What this means, and where I'm going, is that technology has become the most powerful force in the world. All the things that we see today that are changing our lives, we can always trace back to the introduction of some new technology. So it's a force that is the most powerful force that has been unleashed on this planet. My working definition of technology is anything that useful that a human mind makes. It's not just hammers and gadgets like laptops, but it's also law. And, of course, cities are ways to make things more useful to us.
So that's my working definition. It's pretty broad, includes language. But it's interesting to think, as a species, we probably wouldn't survive if we didn't have the capability to invent and utilize technology. But then, to see just with a little bit of technology, we went from not only surviving, but dominating the planet. And so that's kind of crazy. Technology is a pretty powerful force. And of all technology, there's one that seems special, right? The computer. Personal computer sort of came out around the time that I was born. And most people that started interacting with computers, especially young, weren't really any age, would pretty quickly see that there's something interesting about this. And you have to think back because we're all used to computers now, but it seemed like there was something very special about this technology. So what is it? And you know this guy. There are a lot of people that saw.
I didn't.
There are a lot of people that saw they thought computers were cool, personal computers were cool, and all this. But he saw not just the potential, but was able to kind of articulate it. And so, really quickly, this is him kind of articulating.
I think one of the things that really separates us from the high primates is that we're tool builders. Now, I read a study that measured the efficiency of locomotion for various species on the planet. The condor used the least energy to move a kilometer. And humans came in with a rather unimpressive showing about a third of the way down the list. It was not too proud of a showing for the crown of creation. So that didn't look so good, but then somebody at Scientific American had the insight to test the efficiency of locomotion for a man on a bicycle. and a man on a bicycle, or a human on a bicycle, blew the condor away, completely off the top of the charts. And that's what a computer is to me. What a computer is to me is, it's the most remarkable tool that we've ever come up with. And it's the equivalent of a bicycle for our minds.
You might have heard that quote before. Out of context, it seems kind of silly. It's a bicycle for our minds, but you know that you know, he also said it's the most remarkable tool that we've ever come up with. Right? It's sort of the tools tool. So imagine that you've never used a computer before. You know, you've heard about these computer things. I think NASA uses them as a calculator. And then somebody tells you that it's like the pinnacle of human technology, all right? And then you look at these like ugly boxes. You know, you're not going to believe them because it turns out, and we know because we've been using them, that it's not really about these boxes. It's not really about the device at all. It's about you know, all this stuff, right? What you can do with it in the world of software. Because if you think about it, besides CPU and memory, like most of the hardware in a computer is just I/O for software to interact with the world. And computer science primarily concerned with software. So I think, you know, the essence of computing is you know, more about this stuff, software stuff. How many of you took computer science? I didn't, but I did. Among many things that I've picked up along the way, there is this great MIT course. Structure and Interpretation of Computer Programs. Anybody familiar? Yeah. So, but these, all those lectures are online, but this is a clip from the intro because I thought it was. There's a longer version that's really awesome, but this is just a clip.
Actually, that's a terrible way to start. Computer science is a terrible name for this business. First of all, it's not a science. It might be engineering or it might be art. Or we'll actually see that computer, so-called science, actually has a lot in common with magic. And we'll see that in this course. So it's not a science. It's also not really very much about computers. And it's not about computers in the same sense that physics is not really about particle accelerators. And biology is not really about microscopes and petri dishes. And it's not about computers in the same sense that geometry is not really about using surveying instruments. Now, the reason that we think computer science is about computers is pretty much the same reason that the Egyptians thought geometry was about surveying instruments, and that is when some field is just getting started and you don't really understand it very well, it's very easy to confuse the essence of what you're doing with the tools that you use. And indeed, on some absolute scale of things, we probably know less about the essence of computer science than the ancient Egyptians really knew about geometry.
So this was recorded in 1984. And I think we actually haven't made much progress. You know, we have this big industry and like software and stuff, computers everywhere, but we actually, you know, I really believe we have no idea how little we know about computing. Because if you think about what we think of as computing today is actually a handful of cherry-picked ideas from a bunch of researchers and inventors from like the 50s to the 80s that had visions that far exceeded anything that we have today. And only a couple of things could be commercialized, and they just took a couple of things here and there that worked into products. And then that's our computing. And yet, even if, you know, we don't know what it is, we still, you know, think it's the most remarkable tool. He actually, you noticed, he compared it to magic, which is funny, but it's kind of true, right? It's this essence of computing or computer science is kind of about this imagination compiler, right? We have this sort of ultimate sandbox that we can explore ideas and model things and even execute those models. And it can really be whatever we imagine, as long as we can figure out how to, you know, express it, right, in code. And people say that, when I ask people like why they like programming, sometimes a couple of people have said, use these exact words, like, it's like pure creation. right? Do you guys remember when you first like wrote a program and that the kind of magic that it felt? So that's programming. That's what I think computing is about. So we have all these computers. We linked them all up on this global network, and we have them so small they're everywhere on our phones and our watches and our thermostats. But what this really means is that software is everywhere, right? That this imagination compiler is getting installed all around us. When I was in 3rd grade, I wrote a story about a kid who gets sucked into a computer. And this is not a novel idea, because apparently another kid in my class also wrote that story, because I got back his story. And then, of course, Tron was also the same idea. But I think Tron was wrong. I think it's the other way around. Instead of us going into the world of computing, computing is actually slowly expanding into our reality. You probably heard this, maybe? And he's not talking about the world becoming Tron. Little does he know. But now he's talking about industries, right? He's talking about all these sort of traditional non-software industries sort of being disrupted by software companies like Airbnb and Netflix and Uber and Tesla and Amazon, the largest retailer in the world. This is a software company, and it's kicking everybody's ass. And we've long talked about like ubiquitous computing and Internet of Things, but slowly it's kind of happening. You're talking about when iPad came out, people started talking about the post-PC era. This idea that it's not about the computer, right? It's something else, right? So this is really interesting, and it's happening whether it's worth it or not, like a toaster with a computer in it. The world is becoming software-enabled and software-driven. And for programmers, and this is bad news for a lot of people. They're coming like, I don't know if you know, but the most popular job in almost every state in the country is a truck driver. And there's already autonomous trucks that are driving legally. So that's going to happen a lot faster than we realize. But for programmers and those going into programming, which could be anybody, this is generally great news. The problem with this, for me, is that software-driven does not mean programmable. So what do I mean by programmable? For me, programmability is about generativity in software. And generativity is this idea that was actually in a book called The Future of the Internet and How to Stop It. And the idea is that you have generative technologies which are technologies that have more uses than the creator could even imagine, right? Like the personal computer. So many uses. On the other hand, you have sterile technology, which is sort of fixed purpose, doesn't surprise you. You might be able to configure it, but it's an appliance, like it just does one thing. So that as a model is sort of, what generativity is about. It's about, users being able to do a lot more with it than it was sort of intended. And there's a lot of things fell out of the computer, a lot of generative stuff, like the internet is generative technology, Wikipedia is generative technology. So I think it's interesting because computer programming is probably the most generative thing you can do, or it is sort of the medium of the most generative thing, because you can, right? It's an imagination file. You can do anything. But most software that we build with this is usually somewhere in between. Like this is sort of like actual physical things, but when it comes to software, most things are not that generative. They're usually biased towards sterile. So how do we make software more generative? This is what's important to me and what drives me and what these are the values that go into the developer infrastructure that I make. So I'll give you a list of things that'll make software more programmable. And you probably have seen a lot of these. APIs are an obvious one, although it's more about programmability in the greater system. But an API lets you use and drive software from other programs. Easy. We all know that one. And then there's some other things. So for example, hooks, which is, different than APIs, it turns out, like webhooks, which allows you to more easily integrate and do certain customizations. One of the biggest use cases for webhooks is integrations, like GitHub. All their service integrations are because of webhooks, and anybody can add new integrations to it. A lot of libraries, because a hook is just a callback, so a lot of event-oriented programming, a lot of libraries are callback-oriented. But there's a lot of programs that have hooks, like Git and SVN, and they let you do things like, when you commit something, if it doesn't pass some test or linter, it won't let you commit. So you're sort of customizing the workflow. You can do some of that stuff with GitHub because of hooks. Going a step up, which kind of combines hooks and APIs, you have plugin systems, which let you extend and change functionality, add new functionality. It's kind of interesting because most desktop applications have, major desktop applications have a plugin system. Chrome extensions, most professional things like Pro Tools, most audio software has concept of plugins, Photoshop has plugins, Unity has plugins, but most web software doesn't, which is one of the reasons why webhooks was important to me, because it lays the foundation for building web-based plugin systems, which very few people have done so far in the last 10 years. Some people are catching on though. Platforms, if you have a platform, it's a more programmable system because it doesn't really do anything unless you program for it. And in this case, we throw around platform a lot, but anything that runs or supports applications. So your operating system, but by that definition also, like AWS, Heroku, even Chrome and Facebook have the concept of apps. But if you think about it, it's not that different than plugins. If you think of your operating system as just a computing platform with plugins called apps. And then there's a lot of these open things, and people say open system, but that's not very specific. Open architecture is one thing that helps things be more programmable because you have soft encapsulation. Instead of this black box, you can actually see what components it was made with, and you can use those components yourself for something else, reuse them, etc. Most of our open source libraries that we use are sort of by definition open architecture. You can see what their dependencies are. Linux, it's a couple of other good examples. Open ecosystem is usually what people mean when they say open system, which is more about there being a single gatekeeper. So like the web is a level playing field. There's no single gatekeeper. The Linux ecosystem, like anybody can make a Linux program and put it on the internet. Things like the Apple Store making apps for iOS, somewhere in between. It's open-ish, right? But it's certainly not, because there is a gatekeeper, single gatekeeper. And then there's open source, which I almost didn't put on this list because, interestingly enough, it really doesn't make things that much more programmable because it's a little bit more about freedoms. Like if something's open source, then you have the freedom to add an API to it, or hooks, or plugin systems, but that doesn't mean it has any of those things. And in fact, one of the most programmable software platforms I've seen is not open source. It's this operating system. It's called Genera. Anybody familiar with that? Lisp machines. So this is an operating system from 1982-ish, and it's really cool. First of all, well, this one's kind of like, it's written entirely in Lisp. In fact, all the drivers are written in Lisp. So the whole thing is written in Lisp. And you can change any part of it. All the source code for any function in the entire system, from any application or any part of the operating system, including drivers, you can go in and inspect it and change it in real time. You can extend it, you can replace it. The source code is entirely available if you're able to inspect everything. And it has built-in help. It's a really great system. We have nothing like this. Well, maybe the closest thing is Atom. A lot of editors, actually, people will say like Emacs and like, yeah. This is a significant one because it's using a very sort of modern and accessible technology, right? It's written entirely in JavaScript and HTML5. So anybody who starts getting into web development can start customizing this editor or changing any aspect of it. So you can imagine not long from now, there will probably be a JavaScript operating system that has the same properties as generic. In fact, I think I've seen some projects that are already doing that. Another interesting thing about this model of generative technology is it gives us a really unique lens to try and explain hackers and hacker culture, which is, this creative builder, like a Steve Wozniak. To me, I'm starting to define a hacker as, and which I identify with, is a person that needs to use and build generative technology. They don't necessarily know why or know what generative technology is, but they intuit the human significance of generative technology. Right? Most hackers want to build open programmable systems. They tend to prefer systems that have those programmable properties. They even make more sterile systems more generative, like jailbreaking the iPhone. It's now a much more generative platform. Most life hacks, right? If your life hacks is applying generativity to things that you wouldn't expect. The strange thing is that Steve Jobs, his life mission in the 80s and the 90s was to make computers not just personal, but to make them appliances, like the Macintosh. He saw that the real generativity is in software, so let's make the actual device more of an appliance. Just plug it in, turn it on, and point and click to enlightenment. And that's really interesting because his partner, Wozniak, is sort of the hacker's hacker. And it actually shows up in one of their first arguments from about the Apple II. Any of you know about the Apple II expansion slots? This argument? So this is a clip from the latest Steve Jobs movie. And it's weird to see Seth Rogen as Wozniak, but when they say open system, just replace that with generative, and when they say closed system, replace that with sterile.
Now, I gave you everything you wanted on the Apple II. You don't ask for a lot? There isn't a single fight you lost.
Do you concede the slots are the reason for the success
You
of the
can't
Apple
possibly
II?
still be talking about
I
the
have
slots,
a
man.
point.
It's
The
been
8
7
slots
years.
on the Apple
You're
II.
still doing it. You're talking
The
about the
slots.
slots. There's something wrong with you. This argument started in the garage.
What are you talking about? Why would you only want 2 slots?
A printer and a modem.
With 8 slots. This is a huge deal that we were able to add 8 slots.
I appreciate the engineering, but it's not what we're doing.
And thank God I won that argument.
Was?
Because the open system is what people love about the machine, and it's why it sold and still sells.
An open system. We're not doing an open system.
Of course we are. That's what people want, and the breakthrough on the Apple
People don't
II.
know what they want until you show it to them.
Serious users want to customize, they want to modify, they want to jack it up. They want hardware engineers like me to expand its capabilities, okay? Keyboards for music, better soundboard, better display boards, improved memory cards. And it's why there are 3,000 people here right now. The slots are what allow the Apple II to run. For just one example, VisiCalc, which for my guess single-handedly sold between 2 and 300,000 machines. They want slots.
They don't get a vote. When Dylan wrote Shelter from the Storm, he didn't ask people to contribute to the lyrics. Plays don't stop so the playwright can ask the audience what scene they'd like to see next. Painters are on the verge of a tectonic. Hobbyists? Printer and a modem, 2 slots.
So they're both kind of right. He was upset because Wozniak was making something for hobbyists, and Jobs wanted everybody to experience this thing, the personal computer. And so his theory was you make it an appliance, you make it simple, you make it consumer friendly. And he was kind of right because that's mostly what our industry has done. It's sterilized computing, for the sake of non-programmer users. But what that gives us is our computing today, I consider it pop computing, right? It's this sort of mass-produced computing that ironically sterilizes what is a fundamentally generative, if not the most generative technology we have. And so obviously that, kind of had to happen for it to get to where it is. However, to me, programmability is about reclaiming the inherent generativity of computing, because that's where the real power is, right?
Isn't that two different levels? One's hardware level, one's the software.
Certainly, but and really when I'm talking about programmability, that's the software world.
So they
But then-
sterilize at the level of the computer.
Yeah, but
that has an inhibited.
Yeah, and most software though is incredibly sterile. Like if you think about what you can do in software, you should be able to kind of like customize anything because it's software. It's malleable. You can do whatever, but your operating system doesn't let you do that. So most of our software gets in the way of what you could do with software and what you could do with computing. So that's an important thing to me. A lot of hackers and technologists, they fight for open source, which is great, but I think it's actually programmability and generativity that we should be fighting for, because you can have programmable systems that are not open source. Think about any web service, right? There's no concept of open source web service. There's open source software that you can run, but the service itself, like that instance of that API endpoint, like that's not open source. We haven't figured out how to do that yet. I'm working on it, but so I think it is more important than open source. Now that open source is now that we solved open source, right? This is really more important. I'm going to play one more clip, and this is for a book that was called "Program or Be Programmed," which is actually, it makes a compelling case for why you should learn to program, but it actually makes a lot of other the implications that are made are really great.
When human beings acquired language, we didn't just learn to listen, we learned how to speak. When human beings acquired text, we learned not just how to read, but how to write. And now that we acquire computers, we should learn not just how to use them, but how to program. Back in the 1980s, learning to use a computer was the same thing as learning to program one. But as computers got easier to use and more user-friendly, the distance between using a computer and knowing how it worked got longer and wider until we had extremely opaque interfaces through which you do what the program says without any idea of what's actually going on behind the screen. Ask any kid what Facebook is for, and he'll tell you, well, Facebook is here to help me make friends. No, they're looking to figure out how to monetize people's relationships. If you don't know what the software you're using is for, then you're not using it, but being used by it. In a digital age, or in any age for that matter, whoever holds the keys to programming ends up building the reality in which the rest of us live. Thanks to these technologies, we now have the ability to remake our economy, our education, our government, even our religions. If we don't seize the opportunity to remake our world, I promise you someone or something else will do it for us.
So to summarize, right, we're talking about technology, most powerful force of technology, computers, sort of the technology. It's really cool because it can model almost any other technology. And so software's taking over and becoming the most powerful force. It's positioning itself all around us on our devices, on our bodies, and whatever. Like people talk about that, and it's happening slowly but surely. And we have a skill, programming, that lets us wield that power, but we can't even really fully utilize it because most of these systems are not programmable. But also, we don't even really fully understand that power, right? Because our idea of computing has been limited to what could be sold to those that don't understand it. But we're getting to a point where like everybody kind of understands it. And we're getting to a point where we will have a sort of like baseline programming literacy, right? Not necessarily professional programmers, but kind of programmatic thinking. So as tying back into my mission, really, this is the reason why it's important, is because I want us to have this sort of full potential of computing and generativity, and I want that to be accessible and empowering to everybody and not just businesses, right? So yeah, I don't really have a call to action other than like take these ideas and think about them. I have no specific ideas other than to help me make the world more programmable. I've been doing it for 10 years, and a lot of interesting stuff has fallen out of it. And a lot of that has been foundational stuff, right? I've been waiting for webhooks to sort of be all over the place, and now they are. Docker lets me build the platforms that I want to build a lot of this stuff. So really the most exciting stuff will be in the next 10 years. Yeah, that's it. Thank you for listening. Do you want to talk?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yeah.
Sort of back to the beginning and the philosophical aspect of technology that we were talking about. One thing that is true about all new technology is that it ends up solving some problems, and it always creates new problems that never existed in the world before, which call out for more technology to solve them.
Yeah.
So that's generative just in itself, isn't it?
Yeah, that's also very frustrating. There's an orthogonal idea to this that has nothing to do with technology, and that's design. I'm really into sort of design thinking because there are a lot of ways you can deal with problems, and one of the ways that you think, oh, you can just solve problems. There's different approaches to solving problems, and the one that we think of as solving problems is actually to create a solution, which actually requires the problem to still exist, and it generally creates more problems. But one way you can, a better, more effective way to deal with problems is to redesign the system so the problem cannot exist. And that's something that is not a technology problem or engineering problem, it's a design problem. And in larger systems, it can be a political and social problem. So, but this is not like, no one thing is like, oh, that's it. The world's very complicated.
But as you empower that generative program, you allow poor designs, right? I mean, you empower. So are you saying one has to come with the other? Otherwise, you might not end up, your programmable world ends up being bad.
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to go through sort of messiness to sort of figure out, I mean, almost everything I've seen is sort of like when we come up with something new, it's like, okay, the first time we're sort of just figuring it out, and the next time, it's sort of like when you, who was it? Somebody had this really great thing about why we like to reinvent the wheel and rewrite stuff. It's because you're kind of rewriting it until you get the abstraction right. So once you get the right abstraction, it's like as simple as it can be, and it just fits, right? I mean, in the best case, right? You can rewrite stuff and make things worse, but but this is where innovation comes from. Like all generative systems, that's sort of where you find innovation. It's, to make something accessible, anybody can kind of tinker, and that's where you get like new ideas that, whatever can turn into companies or whatever. But and then from there, we figure it out, right?
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting. Even as you look at life itself, you can think there's a lot of programming. Cells, bio. So it's an interesting.
Yeah. There's also. What was I going to say? You distracted me. Okay, I'll just go. What? Go ahead.
I didn't mean to distract you. I'm sorry.
No, I forgot what it was. Go ahead.
Okay. I wanted to get your opinion on Apple and particularly Tesla moving towards very much appliances, right? So Tesla, they own the car. They don't want you doing anything with their code. If you want to sell your car, you have to offer it to them first. So give me your thought on that.
The guy that wrote the book that talked about generative and sterile, Jonathan Zittrain, he's mostly kind of neutral about whether generative and sterile, which one's better. And he made the point that there's probably certain things that we want to be sterile, like medical appliances, because there does, what generative systems tend to have is chaos, and it's messy, and you don't want that for something that's going to save your life or something that is as dangerous as a vehicle. So maybe there are certain cases where it's fine that it's sterile, and it's probably best that it's sterile. But what would be nice is to have like that as the default, but then there's the experimental, dev kit or whatever for it, and you can like do whatever, and then it has to go through this whole process of like quality assurance or whatever, this more traditional, rigorous thing for anything that's built on that generative platform before it can be used, right? Maybe there's like a jailbreaking your Tesla, and those people are like risking their lives to like use some third-party hack for their car. So I think generally generativity is important. I didn't get to why I think generativity is important in general, which Kevin Kelly talks more about in sort of what technology gives us. What technology does, and this sort of creating this branching, all these new technologies, really it's about new options, new choices, new freedoms, right? These are, and when you think about, for example, like what, it would be really sad if, for example, Mozart existed before the piano was invented, or you can any kind of major artists, like if their medium hadn't existed yet. And so it's very likely that there's many people in the world today, some kids, that their medium that they can use to sort of find some kind of purpose and like what self-expression and something that means a lot to them, that doesn't exist yet. So I think it's generally a good thing to have all these options. So that's generally why I'm biased towards generativity, so that there are more options and freedoms and yada, yada, yada.
And you mentioned the safety and separating, so as the world of computing or programming exits the sandbox,
Yeah.
and starts entering our lives, right, as IoT and hardware itself, normal, starts to have more and more software. What are your thoughts about curbing, I guess, some of that, or the dev kit versus? There's all sorts of implications, right?
A lot of implications. I mean, there's a lot of implications in general, like the fact that all the biotech stuff that's going on,
Right.
like people just like making crazy like
Artificial intelligence. There's
yeah.
many other areas now that it's, like you said, the world of software, what used to be sandboxed in the computer, in the bits and bytes, but as those bits and bytes and as the hardware, the things we interact in the real world start to be programmable, they come to life in the physical.
And there's a lot of dangerous things.
Right. So that's why I'm asking. The more generative that is, the more it can empower things that maybe we didn't want.
This is
like
a
the
great,
nuclear bomb,
question for humanity. It's sort of, in general philosophically, like, how do we
Where are
deal
the
with the
boundaries?
fact that, technology that can be incredibly destructive is just very, all the stuff about like people being able to 3D print guns and stuff like that. Like,
on a molecular level, you're saying.
Yeah. But like all
Creating
kinds
murder.
of,
Who knows what you can do soon, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Genetically.
Yep. So it's crazy. I don't know how to deal with that.
Yeah.
I kind of can think of like pros and cons to so I don't know, but yeah.
I think open source is a huge key to protecting us from that, because if everything's open, then if there's one bad person that's trying to find a backdoor versus like all these people in this room, if we all have the opportunity to look at that code, we'll find it before.
Yeah, but that's a
Well,
mistake.
different.
That's a mistake of the programmer. That's different from like a mistake or malicious intent of the user.
Also, rewind to Heartbleed, and a bunch of people could look at the code, and did anybody?
Yeah.
Sure.
This is a cool.
And then it goes back to the question: how many are open source consumers versus source contributors? Like I know I
Yep.
am, right? So eventually, how much checking is really happening by the average person that uses the supply chain of software these days, right? I mean, you look at any app, it's 5% coded, 95% taken from somewhere, right? Library or something. So, in theory, yeah, you can go and check it, but how many people are going to go through? The lines of
Maybe
code.
that's the medium for the future.
Right.
I like how deep this conversation got.
Yeah.
Flip side of that
It's
is
a philosophical topic.
that that is an argument in favor of small composable pieces, where you can take one piece, understand what it does, put that together with another piece, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Whether that is a 5 meg OS image running on Docker with a few packages thrown on top of it, or just a straight up Unix utility.
Yeah, I mean architecturally that is more ideal. That still doesn't solve the problem with people like creating viruses accidentally,
Sure.
like literal viruses accidentally in their garage. But I agree, small and composable, which by the way is a whole nother topic. Most companies most open source, modern open source has VC funded companies which are disincentivized to build software that way. So I'd love to figure out an alternative to that, but yeah, any other questions?
Yeah, I have one.
Yeah.
So if I hear you correctly, you don't really know, what the next step is. Like say we don't have a call to action, but this is your mission. So what are you doing now to advance this?
So for the longest, so I saw, what you can do with APIs, and I was like, well, I really want to do a lot of like the hacker kind of mindset is about repurposing things and reusing things for different things. So a lot of things that I wanted to do with webhooks was like, reuse, or one thing you can do with an API, for example, like Asana. Are you guys familiar with Asana task management thing? So it has a great data model and stuff for modeling like tasks and stuff like that. But maybe I don't like the user interface. Maybe I want to integrate with a bunch of other stuff. I can use their API to build my own system that does what I want, and I don't have to build like a data store and implement a lot of the features and functionality that they already have. But there's a lot of stuff I couldn't do if I wanted to like integrate that with another system. Like if I create a task here, that should show up in Basecamp because I'm forced to use Basecamp at my job or whatever, right? And this is where like if this then that has kind of come along, but those again are closed systems. And what webhooks allowed you to do is to actually say like whenever something happens, you can do whatever you want. You run some code that will then put it in another system. You can do synchronization and all kinds of stuff like this. And so that was sort of my first like, oh, okay, so if I want to make the web more programmable, we should all be doing, things need webhooks. And sort of like, well, I can't like just make everything have webhooks. So I just started giving talks at places like Google and various, and because of Super Happy Dev House, I had a lot of, like the guys at GitHub and Twitter and a lot of kind of big companies now would hang out at this party, so I had a lot of influence. And then slowly over time it just spread, right, as an idea, and other people started talking about it. And I also built a lot of tools to support the idea, things like request bin, and local tunnel and demos to sort of show people, sort of a lead by example kind of thing. And that actually led me to App Engine because I was building all these demos. I was like, well, I can want to run all these things, right? And App Engine was the first sort of platform as a service, the idea of no ops, like I don't have to manage the server, right? And I was really interested in this idea of open source services. How can you run a service like a public utility, right? I think that's a really cool idea. Especially for little things that aren't big enough to be a startup. If you look at like the majority of a lot of the interesting like technical things that come out of Y Combinator, they're what a lot of VCs would call like a feature, not a product, right? It's a cool thing. Like a friend of mine went and he did, and I was really frustrated because I had an open source version of this. He did a startup called Notifo, and it was one of the first like services that would give you an API to easily do notifications either to the iPhone at the time or your desktop with like a little growl notification, actually before like the operating system had built-in notifications. And that was really cool because now any app could like send you a notification. And the problem is there's no business model there. Like there's not enough value for them to sustain a business that'll let them take VC money and give 10x return. And so they failed, and because of that, it doesn't exist anymore. So this cool thing that I thought was valuable, that should exist, does not exist. And another problem with startups in general, this is kind of going in tangent, a really great startup recently went through, some of my friends worked at Parse. You guys familiar with Parse? They're like a, they provided like a bunch of like data store, user authentication, mostly for like mobile apps, right? Backend as a service, right? And people loved them, like it was a great experience, like they cared about their users, right? And they built this great service. And they were so successful, Facebook decided to buy them. And Facebook was even like, you know what, we'll let you run autonomously and do your own thing because we get you. We're a cool company. And then just recently they said, this isn't important to us anymore, we're shutting you down. So as a technologist, a creator, the person who wanted to make Parse exist and solve that problem, even if you're successful as a startup, you might lose. The thing you might make might not exist in the future. So there's a lot of problems with this stuff. But anyway, I forgot what was the question?
I was just asking what you personally
Oh,
are
what
doing right
I'm
now
doing.
to advance this.
Yeah. So then I got into platform stuff because I think it's important that we have a way for good services to run without a company associated with them. And so that led me towards building platform infrastructure stuff. And so that led to Docker and a lot of that stuff. And now I have all those tools, like those exist now. And so now I can use those to build, a platform or whatever to start building more cool webhooksy type stuff and other things to kind of lead by example, things that have APIs, things that are programmable, things that have plugins that open up new capabilities and all this cool stuff. And maybe even sort of one idea is, if this platform was run as a public utility that was like a Heroku-like platform but free for people that are building cool APIs and stuff. But I can't do this is not a startup. Like I have to do this in my free time. And so, this is a very sort of like slow and organic thing. I have like tons of projects on GitHub that some of them are very specific, and it's really hard, I think, for a lot of people to see the connection between this like very specific thing and this like bigger picture of a more programmable world. So that's the biggest challenge I have, and this is the closest I've got to even explaining the bigger picture. So all I'm going to do is keep working on open source and find ways to do that sustainably. That's what I'm doing. Leading by example, building more infrastructure for it.
Is it more programmable or more programmable in a generative way? Because I feel like when you added the design aspect of it, it made a lot of sense, right? If you just expose APIs, but they're not extensible or they don't allow you to compose it, then you're making it more, I guess, machine consumable, but not necessarily more generative.
And most of my tools have, not just like some kind of API, but they usually have a plugin system and are made of small, reusable components.
And I think that's what
and they have all these properties. And again, I can do that because I'm not like having to ship a product. Like I don't have a product manager just saying we have to get this thing out, and a company that doesn't care so much about like small things because they're just going to maintain the main thing and all that stuff. It's really bad right now in the systems world. Like even Docker itself, I'm really frustrated with. But like all these guys, and I know all these guys, and it's really frustrating that it's like creating a really like most of our system software historically was all just sort of like made by people that just that had to make these things, and they were small enough, like little Unix command line things, that it was easy enough to just like make something, make it open source. But now we're dealing with like complex like cluster manager systems and a really complicated domain. And I try and like break it down into small components, and then people learn those components and they see how they can become like a cluster manager. But most companies are just incentivized to build a solution that they can sell. So they're just like build this big thing and say here. And then it's really complex and it like steps on the toes of other people. And no one's solution is going to like solve everybody's problem, so you have to use other things, and then they conflict because they're like stepping on each other's toes. It just makes things more complicated, and that is a really shitty world to live in. But that's what we have. So that's why I'm like really interested in finding like alternatives to building software that way. But until that happens, I'm just like slowly doing my own thing.
Cool.
Good. Other question?
Yeah, I was just going to say, just kind of, this was great. Thank you, Jeff. I just recently wrote a post on this, kind of looking at chatbots and Slack as sort of, if we break apart our applications and think about how we're interacting and the changes of interfaces that we have, I would challenge each of us as we interact and do our jobs to be done each day. Look at each of the steps and the things that you're doing and think about the applications you interact with, and think about what if the applications that we interact with weren't one application that we launched from our phones or from our desktop or from a bookmark or Chrome plugin or whatever, but we're rather comprised of everything that we interact with during the day. Various devices, various interfaces, various pieces of software, a lot like what you were talking about.
Are you talking about, instead of thinking in terms of applications, thinking of systems that
Yes.
go beyond?
Yeah. So,
yeah, that's
so
a
the
big-
best way to paint the picture that I found so far is extend the application from an icon or a bookmark and still call it an application, but kind of call it a bigger application. But yeah, it's really about systems.
Yeah.
And then putting an API to each of those little things that we do and allowing our day to be comprised of the interactions with those APIs and us with them through the various interfaces that are exposed to
Is that
us.
like more of a multi-channel, kind of multiple UIs with the core?
Yeah, but extend it to the point where everything that you do, if it had an API, what would happen if you could compose your own applications that allowed you to conduct the work you wanted to do and you needed to do on a daily basis the way you wanted to do
Yes.
it, and empower other people to do that as well?
That's the generative method.
Yeah, exactly,
Right.
exactly. So,
That's how
the
small
best way to get
components and
there then
APIs,
is to look at what we're doing on a daily basis and then figure out how to break those things down. And then we have to get to the point where we don't rely on VCs to make it happen. We have to get out of the mindset that I gotta have VC money to take something to market, and go back to the idea that we can have side projects, we can bootstrap things, and we can start to tell those stories bit by bit to help people catch that vision and then take it forward.
Yeah.
Because you can't, as you said, you can't build 10x, 20x, 30x businesses
Yeah.
to be able to get funded the way you want to get funded to be able to work on those things. But we used to not do that years ago either, you know. So we have to kind of step out of that mindset. And really what I've seen over the years is it takes very little money on the technology side to launch anything, right? We all know that. We don't have to buy
it's
racks of
getting
servers
cheaper
anymore.
and cheaper, yeah.
The risk is in the product and the business model. So why aren't we as developers building those kinds of things and putting them out there and trying them out?
Yeah. That's like what I want, is a world where people can build stuff and not have to worry about making it a business.
Yeah.
Because right now it seems like as a technologist, the only way you can build anything is to like raise money and start a company. And maybe it's just part of like a cult, like it's an assumption we don't even think about. It's like, of course, that's what I do. So that's why I would like to see other. Well, I mean, you can do it. Like I had a model called auto-sustainable services, where basically I wanted to try this with a lot of things. And actually, it was this notification service, and that's why I was really upset that my friend was doing a startup, because I'm like, why not just help me out with this thing? Because if we prove this is like, that opens up all kinds of possibilities. And the idea was, if you run a service and it is minimal operation, because there's time and operations are the huge thing with running a service. Like you think like support is a thing, like, and open source things have to deal with that, not with IRC and stuff. But typically, if you were to run something, you have operations. It's got to be up. Who's going to respond when something's down? Heroku gets you to a certain level where a lot of that you don't have to worry about, and with a couple of tweaks you can actually make it so that the community is able to, any of the maintainers are able to deploy a new version or whatever. And so then it comes down to cost, which has gotten a lot smaller with App Engine, Heroku, and all these things that we have, but it still costs something, especially if you have like data stores and all this. So the idea I had was sort of an ongoing, how do public nonprofit utilities work? They do fundraising, right? Like Wikipedia even, they do annual fundraising. The way those work is they figure out what their annual budget, what it costs to run, and then they say, we're gonna do fundraising, and they get a lot of money, as much as they can, and then they go, it's like a batch operation. And the idea is, what if you could automate it? Because you're taking humans out of the loop. They're volunteering, it's via open source kind of style. And so then it's really, you just have to pay for the cost of running the service. So it's a lot cheaper, and you just fundraise sort of automatically. And the idea is that if if nobody's willing to donate, then it'll just stop existing. If it's not providing value enough for anybody to, and the cool thing about donations, there's a lot of cool things. I've done nonprofits before. There are a lot of psychological tricks. You know, you go back to the people that donate a lot, ask them for more because they're more likely to. If you have a higher suggested rate, you're more likely to get more than if you just say, like, give me some money. And so there's a lot of tricks that you could bake into a system that would basically automatically fundraise. So, like, there's enough money in an account for this thing to run, and then it starts, you know, running out of money. So then you know, at the bottom you can donate. It then pops to the top, and it's like, hey, the service is going to disappear if you don't, like, donate. And so that's the auto-sustainable model, and it does depend on, like, good infrastructure, which is why I've invested a lot of time in building things like Docker and all this stuff to make that feasible. So we're so close.
Have you tried an approach like what you just described with an actual project?
I keep trying to. With the notification thing, I couldn't because he, like, outcompeted me, and I got really upset, and I was like, and then I was like, okay, fine, I give up, and then he's like, okay, it doesn't work. So then neither of them exist anymore. and then I had a tool called Local Tunnel that was really cool. Does anybody use ngrok? Made by a friend of mine. It was inspired by a tool I made, but I didn't have time to maintain it as a service, so he made his own version and made a small little lifestyle business out of it. And that was a candidate for it. And so I've had a lot of things that were good candidates, but at this point, because there's so many other things involved in making that work, that I'm trying to avoid running services until I have all the software to make actually running the service easy. Does that make sense? That's why I was, like, doing Docker and infrastructure stuff.
Don't you think there's an advantage of the entrepreneurial model, because ultimately the viability of it as a business means it is something that solves a problem people want.
Yeah, yeah.
Because most people,
But,
when you ask them for money,
yep.
it's a testament to whether it provides you value.
The problem is markets are weird, and there's different ideas of value. For example, like music. People make music, right? But it's not very viable business-wise.
No.
People have stopped paying for music. And so, but that doesn't mean that that music doesn't have value.
Right.
So there's a lot of things that have value that for some reason the market value does not correlate. And so, you know,
but it will eventually self-correct, but it'll go through, I mean, eventually if you were to, I think most people,
Yeah,
I mean, I pay for music.
But there's a lot of, like, little things. Like, nobody's gonna pay for the command line tool cat, right? Or, like, you know, WC, like, there's certain things that people will not pay for because it just doesn't provide enough value.
I see what you're
But you really, like, it should exist.
Right, right. I see what you're saying.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
Unless the payment amount is donation only, CAT will cease to be maintained. Okay, I'll throw a couple Satoshis your way. Please keep maintaining CAT because it's kind of important.
Yeah. Yeah, and it works for, you know, those kinds of established things, of course, is like, yeah, catch.
I think it's also a psyche too, because people have gotten used to it being free.
Yeah, and that's
So
part of the
our-
reason why
our
market
more
stuff
we
is so weird.
expect a house, we expect a call. I mean, these not because they don't have value
Yeah.
and low cost. It's just
It's
so I
not
think
it's not entirely rational.
Right, yeah.
So that's we have to deal with that. So that's why, you know, anyway.
Yeah, it's interesting.
So those are the kinds of things that I'm working on conceptually, that, you know, slowly but surely, and this is all part of that. This is kind of makes sense, like what I mean by my mission and kind of all these little efforts. It's a lot for one person to do for free, so I need to get organized, and then hopefully people can help out. Individual projects I get help with sometimes, but, you know, they're always for a bigger thing, so it's really hard to have that kind of multi-level.
Yeah, but I think the other side of it, other than is the education of people too, because anything that's generative usually requires a level of understanding.
Yep.
So you can maybe see that other side.
Yeah, any sustainable model I have for this, ideally, the company that I've been working under for a while is called Glider Labs, and we've done consulting with a lot of companies to do Docker deployments and stuff like this. And it's currently sort of in pseudo limbo, but one thing that it does have, and it's used more than the consulting stuff, are open source projects. But I think people don't realize that, like, we're not really getting paid to work on those things. But it would be really nice. I've been trying to figure out a business model, a new kind of business model to support a modern sort of Xerox PARC, Bell Labs type of thing, where open source innovators can come and actually work on these kinds of projects.
Have you even thought about, I mean, most organizations run so inefficiently. I mean, so just, and I don't mean in a pro bono side, but you could, there's so much, even in the commercial, like you said, developer infrastructure, that if it were improved, and organizations, because of their commercial mindset, often don't invest in the very things that could make them better.
Yeah, yeah.
So,
but
there's an interesting area.
it's so there's one really big problem, which is big companies, enterprises, the ones with money, they have kind of all this like legacy stuff. Like what they need are solutions for legacy problems, and everything that I'm trying to do is building stuff for the future. So the only real people that are doing that are startups, but startups don't have as much spending money as those big companies. So it's
Catch-22 in some ways.
funnest situation. Anyway, I think that there's plenty of time, so thank you for
Thank you.
having
All right, so we got just a few more things to take care of, and then I will leave you guys alone. The first thing is we got a few events, and if you guys know of events, I'd love to hear from you as well. One of them is, is it OzCon? I've actually never tried to pronounce that out loud before. We've got a couple of codes here for a 30% discount code if you're thinking about attending that. So I'm going to write that stuff up on the board, and you guys can write this stuff down if you're interested.
April 7th that the early bird?
It is May 16th through 19th.
Where is OzCon?
It's here in Austin. Here.
But where, at the convention center?
I think so. Was it? I don't remember.
Does that work for the exhibition hall?
Okay, so I've got one here that'll apply. This one is going to apply to any badge. And then Expo Hall only is PC Expo.
And those are 30%?
Yeah, it's at the convention center.
The first one is 30% off, and I think this one will actually get you into the Expo Hall entirely for free. So that's pretty nifty stuff. I think send Keith an email and say thanks for that stuff. As always, ATX Hack for Change. That's going on June 3rd through 5th. So they've got a pretty amazing success rate in actually keeping those projects up and running. So it's not just build it on Saturday and watch it die on Sunday. So sign up for that if you're interested. Who tonight is hiring? So, okay, stand up and tell us who you're with and who you're looking for.
With a company called Modern Business Solutions, or a startup in Austin. Deal mainly with data monetization. I built our first API that we're doing in-house and gave our first demo yesterday to a customer that wants to purchase it as a service, and now we need more developers to help it grow. And we're also looking to start an ESP similar to Constant Contact. That's future. So I have cards for you guys. Anybody that's interested, I'll stay here to the end.
How about you?
Hi, I'm David. I'm with a company called Ology. We're pretty small. We've got an engineering team of 6. We are working with learning and documentation in the government and healthcare space. We have a few government contracts and some work with some, we're working on a product that we're deploying at a hospital hospital in Florida. So if you're interested in working in government or medical, contact them.
One more. My name's Ryan. I've got a startup. I'm looking for basically a co-founder right now. I can push this thing myself, but we need to compete in speed, right? So I'm really looking for a good, dedicated Rails developer. What we're doing is basically got to connect brokers, real estate brokers, with their advertisers. Because right now they're trying to advertise their properties online. They got to go to 50 places and upload the same data 50 times. Then if price changes, they got to do all 50 things. Let's centralize that stuff. So I'm looking for a coder. Come talk to me afterwards if you're interested.
Is anybody a Go programmer? Because I guess technically, Glider Labs, we are not quite in limbo. We do contract work, deploying like our a lot of our open source stuff with a lot of companies. We work with American Express and some other interesting companies, but I work with a couple of other people sort of on a contract basis, so it's not like a traditional startup, but you know, if anybody wants to, if you're interested in getting paid to work on Go stuff in this sort of like Docker ecosystem type stuff, without working at like a big startup and also having ties in the open source world, then there's potential working with me.
And as always, I work for UShip. We're right down the street. If you are interested in working in a .NET shop in the logistics industry, really sexy stuff, come talk to me later. It's actually pretty fun. Who is looking for work? All right, stand up, introduce yourself.
Justin Joyce, done some contract work recently with Version Fanatic, and just looking for a JavaScript position. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Paul. I mostly do Python and JavaScript stuff. I have a lot of experience in system admin stuff too, primarily Linux and Unix.
My name is Karen Garcia, doing pretty much anything in Ruby on Rails and JavaScript. So, yeah. So.
Great. Anybody else hiring or looking for work? Great. Okay. Well, guys, come up and say thanks to Jeff. This was a really thought-provoking talk. I really enjoyed this. I'm going to be kind of scratching my head about this for a while. This ran a little bit longer. The presentation and conversation ran a little bit longer, so we got about 15 more minutes in this room. Drink beer, so I don't have to carry it out of here. Enjoy.
Thank you.
That was great. Thank you. Thank you very much. And haven't ever thought about, you know, it's kind of like there's lots of libraries. You were kind of saying this too. There's lots of libraries that we sort of take for granted, and it's sort of easy for somebody to make those things. But now there's no operational overhead to them, or not much. Tiny cost of actually running something and bearing the operational cost of it.
I mean, even if it's not a service, open source software does have a funding problem. A friend of mine's working a lot on like making more of that, like people aware of it, and hopefully companies are. You know, I've seen more and more companies have like.
Oh, really?
Open source sponsorships and programs to help fund open source. Still very early stages, so I'm seeing like some change. But yeah, it's even more work to like fund a service that runs, you know.
I don't think I've ever tried to, and I don't think I've ever really thought about the problem before. There's a lot of
Nobody's
glue.
incentivized to.
Yeah, there's a lot of glue that could be really good to have.
Yes. So my idea is if the glue exists, then more people might have the idea, right?
Yeah.
That, like, oh, that could exist. So that's working.
Which specific glue are you guys referring to?
Got it.
Sorry?
Which specific glue are you?
Well, I mean, yeah, exactly, because that's kind of what all those sort of like system utilities that we mentioned, that's kind of the function. The GIF library that we all take for granted, that kind of stuff, it really enables you to do a lot of.
I haven't even used it for
a lot of other stuff.
Yeah. One of the first projects that actually
Just
had
kind of-
in mind that like actually had an idea that there was take it over themselves. But I have an idea for like the next version of it.
In this case, even if you've got.
Nobody wants to be detoured from what they're trying to do. Who's running it?
No, they were sponsoring it by basically like funding
webhooks out there.
I never used those.
You still have to have.
Yeah.
I think I dropped out right.
You still have to have.
It's kind of painful.
Right after they introduced it, like if they
glue all those things together. Automation.
So yeah, it's just some volunteer stuff. Actually, it was when I was at risk of like almost dying as a process, and then somebody stepped up and was like, okay, I'll do it. And he was really good at getting other people to join his teams.
Have you been?
And this guy named interesting too.
Well, I need to check out the latest version. It's my idea, but obviously like doing some like stuff with marketing sticks.
Well, like you could.
I mean, it's so simple to understand. You
have that idea.
Nothing in there.
Yeah, but you want to.
That's good. That's
They have exactly this kind of project I started a few years ago.
So do you have more details about
I don't really want to bear responsibility for operation.
You didn't write the text.
It's not quite that. I don't get quite
I tried to Google you and one of the
to actually keep up. But if there's other people involved.
oh, right. Yeah, that other job.
Something
I think we're looking at programs and stuff like.
Yeah, I was looking for the
So it's really interesting. I don't have to. I get a lot of inbound stuff like we're like, hey, we're thinking about doing Docker. Some parts like pure text. I decide whether or not I just work with them. And I work on my other colleagues. Like we usually work together on stuff.
It is.
A while back when I was focusing on that, I was how much
Right.
I'm willing to take on more work if there's other people that want to do it.
Yeah, there's like,
does
you
that
know,
make sense?
even
Which
like
I can, kind of work with.
Even if somebody
Basically,
buys
I was doing a lot of people there to work and realizing I'm not actually getting
train them probably.
good stuff like open source stuff does.
Wait, but I thought you mentioned that like.
No, I have not been to
Stuff that you were doing
36
with
as of yet.
Yeah, well, the way that works
Only
is
areas which
most
I've
of the time,
explored within, I mean, I only
our
have one
clients,
computer left.
basically want the open source stuff that we have. So it's more like deploying the open source. Actually, like working on it is sort of a little bit like it doesn't usually work out where the clients pay to work on it. But the way it's organized is like, I don't know.
I've been to
The
one
people that I've worked with before, it's like they're already interested in stuff.
Yeah, it's not even really true that you're into the projects.
And then they have a section of using those things that they're very similar. So I mean,
Usually is it mostly related to Docker or?
usually Docker related.
I've never used, I haven't contributed to Docker, but I use, I go in general, I was, contract with writers to share how the XMVM type server that was pretty cool.
Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff in that. Right, because you know, all the Sparklet,
If it's not, I mean, if it's up your alley, like we can talk more about it.
That solve issues about you do.
Like DevOps kind of stuff. That are it's sort of like, I'll talk to a client or do qualification. I'll be like, hey, you need to work on this project.
Slightly different problems, but they share this marketplace.
Yeah, why don't you?
What do you do right now?
Me?
Yeah, I'm sorry I missed the talk, I wasn't the
two or three different.
I did like the Programmable program.
I'm doing open source programming. I'm actually just kind of living off saving the doing completely unrelated stuff to all this. I'm working on an album.
You know, a lot of people on this
game
project
projects.
internally, but then you.
I'm actually more of an
But,
analyst.
as I find a way to sustain working on this stuff,
Data.
there are a lot of people
Actually,
still working on
been
it.
in mesh,
People
mishmash
using
of
it and
stuff.
how other contributors.
Project management support.
Do you eventually have some banks to do?
Different projects, department. Primarily, I've been on the reporting analyst side.
None of these, the best clients are the ones that have a lot of money. So,
I'm like a jack of all trades.
right now we only have one client, but again, like I said,
So what's
I don't even go back to other people. There's probably a lot of work to do in our own clients. Basically, I was trying to convince a friend of mine to like run the service side of this because I don't want to really do it. Like I can't do it, I still want it. But so now it's basically like somebody emails me and I'm like, do they have a lot of money? Does it fit like what we want to do? And then I'm like, either do I or one of my colleagues want to work on that. That's basically what I do.
So do you are you like a preferred server with those banks, or do you go for some kind of like?
I usually don't work with the bigger like banks, usually like contractors or
just trying to break the walls down.
I thought I remember like a couple of banks.
I know Will's been out there for
and
it seems like it's still like that's the fact
is a digital.
I mean, next to JavaScript,
securities company.
What would be what would be the set of like the 12-factor equivalent of?
I don't think banks would be very fun. It's one of those things, like I said, like a lot of our best clients are startups because they're the ones that
got a little bit into it.
and they're the ones who
Are kind of like a bank, right?
I'm not into it. I'm not that.
Yeah. So they're like the closest to a financial institution like that. That we're working with. We're actually working with their R&D lab,
I'm not in that level yet.
which they're sort of doing things in their own world, like
expertise
on AWS and stuff. Most of their and so
there's a lot of
they're relatively stuff. So that was the only reason I was working for American Express. Like if I had to do sort of like dealing with big enterprise legacy stuff, like
right.
is that what you're interested in, working with big companies?
I mean, like, it sounds interesting. Why not?
Business issues.
You want to be in Austin?
That are in all those industries.
Or are you okay with moving somewhere else?
As many.
Because if you want to be in fintech and you want to be somewhere where you're doing something interesting, Capital One's doing more interesting stuff. Do you have to go like Dallas or something like that, or Virginia? Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't primary Dallas, but like,
They've got a San Francisco office, Dallas, where they do a lot of development, and Northern Virginia and Richmond, Virginia. So they're doing interesting, a lot of interesting things. And if you just go look in the fintech space, there's a bunch of stuff going on right now. Capital One's leading it.
Yeah, the
There's a
really
lot.
cool thing about that, one of the things I really liked about it before I started.
What do you do?
That was just
I do API training, consulting, so I teach a lot of workshops for companies, cross-functional teams, sit in a room, teach people how to think in APIs. And then I do API design consulting and software architecture.
Yeah, so if it's
No, I know Pete pretty well. He and I've done training together. I live up too far north to get down here every month.
They don't get
is it your company or?
No, this is what's going. They do API testing. Some of the projects Jeff talked about being contributed to are part of the projects that we're going to maintain. Really cool.
They're the ones that
My idea
they're the ones who have some service and so on.
but that per payment might they may not be direct.
Our road competitor and just had Docker as a
In
side.
our case, they are. So it makes it really easy.
So they're responsible for posting up the.
It means a lot of stuff wouldn't happen
It was just a constant
source of because it sort of triggers this whole like wave of sort of modern
In this case,
DevOps stuff and startups
straightened out
and
because
this whole
they
big
often
ecosystem.
usually
But
just kind of injected itself in
like their intern or whatever.
I don't think that's a good thing. There are all these specified startups making system software. They're open source, but
although
bad open source.
Which is
They don't
what
talk to
American
each other.
Express is.
It would have been nice if it just like stayed a small.
That's true, but I mean, one of the things
It wasn't like
essentially
more of their
intern is actually
the efficiency.
Yeah, the cost comes from
standalone.
for everybody.
Well, because you have a more
Yeah.
efficient.
For real experience,
What I know is Rails, I like to use is Rails, if you ship eight cars,
Well, I mean, they already had a service that they were running, yeah, which they eventually sold because they're like,
if you run it,
it's not a big money
that's gonna cost you massive,
Right. But what happened. So we have
what, right, but I think they're moving eight cars instead of one.
Oh, the whole eight, okay,
Yeah.
okay, I thought per car, I was like, whoa, I thought,
So,
you know, you take the
the
whole
minute
eight.
you start helping the carrier arrange to keep that thing full, it's gonna be a hard to full car carrier.
Everyone's
Yeah,
All that money is already.
Right.
Just for the clients to
Yeah,
talk
you
about
can divide it up between everybody
Kubernetes
involved.
amazing.
Everybody
My
ends up
first
happier
thing
than
is
they were
to
to
figure out
begin
what the
with.
problem is and then
And-
tell them that they don't need to.
That's what we discovered, but because you save overall money to the ecosystem of them, so you have to find markets that are inefficient, apply marketplaces.
This is actually my first
I
time.
had fantasies of like,
Pretty nice
facility. You know,
I mean,
at some
you know,
point I
there's-
just
No,
want
I
to
did
make
not.
my version of it that's really
I don't have
simple.
that, I've just never accessed
Like, I don't wanna manage.
radically efficiency.
Yeah.
Sort of like
Over-
But it's a complicated.
I know.
I'm not part of that
Yeah,
deal.
just doing the,
You know, like a lot of places, some of the biggest logistic companies in the world have no software model for their actual shipping, and they do a ton of their like
Someday.
actual planning and reporting.
Right.
Like, I couldn't believe this, but it's pencil
So
and
Jeff,
paper. Literally, I'm not,
Right, I know.
I've been
literally
experiencing the same
pencil and
thing,
paper.
trying to figure out how to push this forward. When
So how do you
they want to do it, because everybody's worried about
So have you developed like any?
The thing I can say is I've been
like
talking to
the-
someone a lot
some of
lately
the big-
about
some of
he
the
tells me
big
stories
advances.
about everything
I
he
was
does.
doing some coding at
Computer to phone system.
He's trying to help me shape the story and figure out how to get it
the
out
short
there.
answer is we don't really know.
So I don't know
But
if
really
you want to chat a little bit, see if there's a way to kind of take some of the things you've been doing and how can we sort of craft a story to help paint the vision and stuff.
I mean, that's the hardest part
we
for me.
provide
To
tell
tell
the
the story. It's hard to like,
found this opportunity.
it's so big and complicated.
Yeah.
So it has to be like
Yeah, they can already afford, you know,
Right.
the
So-
hardware
So I can do it
trucks
myself.
to track them, the software.
I hope with that sort of stuff would be.
They've
But
already,
you need
they've already managed to internalize those costs.
Yeah, I know.
The
Yeah,
little
yeah,
guys,
exactly.
they just do it now.
Exactly.
And you can focus more on like, as I said.
So what a
Yeah.
add-on service do you provide? Like, so we
Well, it's not even that it's added services, it's like literally just like
Who's
the
that?
information.
Oh, you know Ken Lane, right?
Shipper, like tracking.
Oh, API evangelist?
So if you're just on the truck and
Is it
you carry shipments.
No, he's California.
Okay.
But he's independent. He does a lot of. He consults to 3Scale, or 3Scale basically gives him some money to write the API evangelist
The way he
blog
spelled
and
it,
all
the
that
time
sort of
was
stuff.
like the
Shipper's
European.
Day.
He one of the organizers of Abstract.
Like that's useful for us. It's useful for the shipper. It's a huge feature.
Okay, yeah, anyway, so he
costs us, like,
he writes blogs about things at the time of the day, does all sorts of reports, industry reports.
But you charge for that, or not? Just, that's part of the.
So
system?
a lot of what he does is try to figure out how to craft the
Company or is
story.
that- Okay.
Yeah.
I was thinking.
So he's been working with.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
PR
no,
person or
yeah,
something.
no.
that's pretty
So a lot of what I do.
Yeah, I mean, there's
is
some
a
exceptions to
combination
that, but by and
of
large,
consulting,
Yeah,
training,
like,
and writing, on the writing side of it.
Okay.
Kind of how to craft the story. So he's.
So how do you bring?
I sent him an early draft of what I was talking about that I mentioned earlier.
No, I do not.
Sometimes you
He's trying to help me figure out how to